Why is Trump so obsessed with Cuba? It's safe to say that the island is at breaking point. A US oil embargo means that Cubans have had to endure seemingly never-ending blackouts and supply shortages, as well as essentially the collapse of the tourism industry. Now, despite all this, Cuba's government stands defiant in the face of US President Donald Trump's threats to take over the country. But the cracks are beginning to show. So how long can Cuba resist the pressure from the US? Well, that's what we're going to be talking about with William Leogrand. He is a professor of government at the American University in Washington and a specialist in Latin American politics and US foreign policy towards Latin America. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us here on DW. But before we dive in, let's listen in to what the White House has been saying about the situation in Cuba.
Well, Cuba right now is in very bad shape. They're talking to Marco. And we'll be doing something with Cuba very soon.
Mr. President.
We're really focused on this, but we're dealing with Cuba. Marco, do you want to say a couple of words about it?
Yeah, I mean, Cuba has an economy that doesn't work and a political and governmental system that can't fix it. So they have to change dramatically. What they announced yesterday is not dramatic enough. It's not going to fix it. So they've got some big decisions to make over there.
But Secretary Rubio, do you support, and I know this is up to Congress, but do you support easing the trade embargo if you get more cooperation from Havana?
Well, I'm not going to discuss what we would talk about or not. Suffice it to say that the embargo is tied to political change on the island. The embargo is codified. And but the bottom line is their economy doesn't work. It's a non-functional economy. It's an economy that has survived. That revolution, it's not even a revolution, that thing they have, has survived on subsidies from the Soviet Union and now from Venezuela. They don't get subsidies anymore, so they're in a lot of trouble. And the people in charge, they don't know how to fix it. So they have to get new people in charge.
So, William, let's get straight to the top. Why do you think that the US is so obsessed with Cuba right now?
Well, I think it's part of Donald Trump's broader foreign policy strategy, which is based on dividing up the world into spheres of influence. The National Security Strategy document that was released a few weeks ago is very explicit about that and about the fact that the administration regards the Western Hemisphere as our sphere of influence and that the United States has to be, and this is a quote, preeminent in the region. And President Trump has used the word dominant in the region. And of course, Cuba and Venezuela and also Nicaragua are three governments in the Western Hemisphere that have been adversaries of the United States for a long time. And I think the president's strategy is to try to overthrow all three of those governments.
And how should the words, "we'll be doing something with Cuba very soon," be understood now?
Well, it's hard to know for certain. One thing we do know is that the United States has been ratcheting up the economic pressure on Cuba, first by cutting off oil from Venezuela after President Maduro was abducted and brought to the United States, and then declaring that the United States would impose economic sanctions, tariffs specifically, on any country in the world that sent oil to Cuba, which in effect is a naval blockade on energy going into the island. So clearly, the government in the United States is trying to use economic pressure to strangle the Cuban economy to the point where the Cuban government will surrender to U.S. demands. But we don't know what those demands are exactly. We heard sort of a vague idea from Secretary Rubio that, well, their economic policies have to change and the people making economic policy have to change, but nothing more detailed than that.
And I mean, Trump really hasn't outlined any concrete plans at all, like you just said there. But his foreign policy has become more assertive over the last year. So what potential scenarios should we consider, especially given that the US is already so heavily engaged in Iran?
Well, I think the fact that the United States is engaged in Iran now makes the possibility of some short-term U.S. military intervention in Cuba much, much less likely. And we do know that Cuba and the United States are engaged in some kind of talks, initial conversations, to see if there is any common ground between the Cuban position and the U.S. position. President Trump's been talking about that for more than a month, and the Cuban president, Miguel Diaz-Canel, basically acknowledged that Cuba was, in fact, talking with the United States. But still, we haven't heard much about the agenda. In the recent 2-3 weeks, Secretary Rubio, when he's spoken on this issue, has focused in more on economic issues than on political ones. And so, in the clip you just showed, he leads with the economic question, right? Well, their economy doesn't work. They have to make dramatic changes to get the economy going again. When he was at the CARICOM conference in St. Kitts a couple of weeks ago, he really focused in on economic issues, and he said, look, we know that change has to be gradual. We know things aren't going to change overnight, and we're realistic about that. And there has to be dramatic economic changes, and political changes eventually was the word that he used. So that suggests that the economic issues are really at the top of the U.S. agenda. And that's not a big surprise because they were at the top of the U.S. agenda in Venezuela. We decapitated the Venezuelan government, but we didn't change the structure of the Hugo Chavez regime. We've left that essentially in place. And the president has been satisfied with regaining U.S. control over the Venezuelan oil industry. One can imagine an analogous situation in Cuba, where the Cuban economy is opened up to U.S. investors, and claimants in the United States who have property claims from 1959, 1960, 1961 somehow are given compensation for those claims, and U.S. investors can go back into Cuba and make a profit again, and political change can come eventually.
So you said that there was talk of talks having already been going on, and Cuba has said that it is open to talks with Washington, but it will not discuss changing its political system. So let's just listen in to what Cuba's foreign minister had to say about that.
I can categorically confirm that the political system of Cuba is not up for negotiation. And of course, neither the president nor the position of any official in Cuba is subject to negotiation with the United States, nor with the government of any country.
Okay, so Cuba has ruled out regime change. What can they aim for in talks with the US?
Well, it appears that Cuba is calling Washington's bluff on this issue of political change. I think the vice foreign minister was responding to a story that ran in the New York Times a few days ago, in which it said that the United States had put on the agenda of the talks the idea that President Diaz-Canel would have to be removed or have to be replaced. And then, of course, in the earlier clip, Marco Rubio saying, well, the people who are in charge have to change. This is a really bright line for the Cubans. It always has been. They regard demands to change their political system or the people running their political system as a blatant assault on their sovereignty, and they have always ruled that out. Cuba has been willing to talk with the United States about a broad range of issues, even when Fidel Castro was president. But they've always said that talks have to be undertaken on the basis of respect for national sovereignty of both sides, which means they won't negotiate the shape of their political system. They also are reluctant to negotiate the shape of their economic system, but they themselves have recognized that the current economic policies haven't been working very well and have gradually been rolling out changes in those economic policies. So if the United States were to focus on essentially trying to accelerate some of the economic reforms that the Cubans themselves have been talking about, and added with that a relaxation of U.S. economic sanctions so that some of those reforms could actually have a chance to work, that might be the basis for a deal, at least even just an initial deal with other issues to be dealt with down the line.
Okay, so I want to talk a little bit now about the Cuban civilians. I mean, Cuba has been crippled by this oil blockade that was imposed by the Trump administration. What is the situation like for Cuban people right now?
The situation is really desperate for the average citizen in Cuba. There's not enough fuel for garbage trucks to pick up the garbage, so garbage is accumulating on almost every corner. There's not enough electricity for hospitals to conduct operations. There's not enough food in the stores because Cuba imports a substantial portion of its food, and it doesn't have the foreign exchange currency to purchase it. You can't keep the lights on. The blackouts now are reaching the point where the lights are off more hours of the day than they are on. And that means that in many multi-story buildings, there's no water either because the water is pumped up to the upper floors using electrical pumps. And of course, food can't be preserved. There's no refrigeration. And if there's no electricity. So the situation is really very bad. And it's going to get worse, I'm sorry to say, because Cuba is still using some of the reserves that it had at the time that the oil shipments from Venezuela stopped. But that reserve is not going to last more than just a few weeks.
And I mean, what actual actions could the US legally take under international law?
Well, what the United States is doing now is illegal under international law. This is a form of collective punishment. The entire country is being punished because the United States doesn't like Cuban policies. That's a violation of international law. Cutting off electricity and effectively fuel, food, the ability to deliver food, these are all violations of international law. And any kind of military action against Cuba would be yet another violation of international law because there is no conceivable sense in which Cuba poses any security threat to the United States. The Cuban military has been reduced to really little more than a territorial defense force since the collapse of the Soviet Union.
But Cuba has lived through an economic blockade for years. So what makes this specific scenario different?
The key difference here is the effort by the United States to cut off all oil shipments and therefore to essentially cut off energy because 80% of Cuba's electricity comes from the burning of oil in thermoelectric plants. And in that way, to completely collapse the Cuban economy and make life unlivable for people.
And in your opinion, is the Cuban government actually making any efforts to balance ideological continuity with the practical need for reforms here? And if so, how?
Well, I think they are. Raul Castro, back in 2011, so a long time ago, launched an economic reform program that was aimed at trying to put Cuba on a path of transition from the Soviet central planning from the Soviet Union back in the 1970s and 80s to put Cuba on a path of reform leading to more of a market socialist or mixed economy. The idea being to emulate what Vietnam and China had done. But he encountered resistance from stakeholders who had a stake in the status quo, in the bureaucracy in particular. And those bureaucrats were able to slow walk those reforms and on occasion push back on them to the point that the reform program outlined in 2011, which made a lot of sense in terms of opening up the economy, has only partially been put into place. And since COVID, the government has made a number of economic decisions which turned out to be bad ones and aggravated the situation. And we have to keep in mind, too, that ever since the first Trump administration, U.S. sanctions have been tightened and to a level not seen really since the early 1960s, and now with the oil blockade to a level we've never seen before. So the Cuban economy, weak to begin with, suffering from mistakes made by the government, is also now facing an impossible international situation.
Well, let's talk about Mexico now, because it was a key supplier of fuel before the US ban on deliveries. Now it's kind of walking a tightrope between playing a mediating role and being pulled into the crisis. So let's listen to what Mexico's president said today.
We have been promoting humanitarian aid. In fact, another ship carrying humanitarian aid is leaving today for Cuba from the Mexican government. And we will continue to support the people of Cuba and seek ways to provide them with fuel without affecting Mexico.
So what leverage, if any, does Mexico have in all of this?
Well, Mexico's in a very difficult position at the moment. They have been a real friend of Cuba. Last year, they supplied Cuba almost with as much oil as Venezuela did, partly because Venezuelan production has been in decline for a long time. The old Venezuelan government didn't maintain the equipment properly, and it deteriorated over time. And Mexico has stepped up, or had stepped up, to fill that gap, if you will. And Mexico was ready to send Cuba some additional oil earlier this year when President Trump issued this international threat of tariffs to any country that sent Cuba oil. And at that point, President Sheinbaum paused the oil shipment from Mexico because Mexico right now is engaged in a very sensitive trade negotiation to reform the North American trade agreement. And that is absolutely critical to the Mexican economy. And so instead of sending oil, what Mexico has been doing, as we heard from the president, is sending other kinds of humanitarian aid, food, medicine, and so on. And that's laudable because the Cuban people need that kind of assistance. But it was interesting in the clip to hear the president say that they were looking for ways to send fuel to Cuba as well without doing harm to Mexico. And that's a tough circle to square, given the Trump administration's intention to try to keep all oil out of Cuba. Just the other day, President Trump put out a waiver on the sale of Russian oil in order to try to increase the global supply and hold prices down, even though Russian oil has been sanctioned. But when Russia started out by sending 2 tankers on the way to Cuba, the Trump administration right away issued another executive order excluding Cuba from destinations that this waiver covers. So Cuba as a destination is still not allowed under U.S. policy. And at least one of the Russian tankers, as a result of that, has turned around.
Very interesting. And you did mention there that Mexico has sent or is sending at least one aid ship to Cuba. But given the island's severe fuel shortages, how much relief can a flotilla like this actually realistically provide?
So it's a bit of a Band-Aid, frankly. Although, if enough countries step up and provide even just humanitarian assistance for Cuba, that will ease the suffering of the Cuban people to some degree. But there has to be some way for the Cubans to gain access to fuel in order to keep the economy running, even at a reduced level. And at this moment, it is not clear where that will come from.
Well, let's take a listen in now to the kind of struggles that people in Cuba are facing.
This area is now having water problems. People are hauling water and waiting for the water truck. They're saying it's because of the oil shortage. Since oil is not coming into the country, the pumps don't work. The system runs on electricity, so there's no pumping for the whole network. That's what we've heard, well, not exactly officially, but that is what people are saying on the streets.
Now that so many hotels are closed and there's hardly anyone in the streets, we have very little work. And we're really feeling it. Everything is much harder for us now.
We've had economic problems for years, and now we're worse off than ever before. And there's no solution in sight. There's nothing to indicate that tourism is booming again, or that the economy is recovering. There's no sign of that.
Now, William, I want to get a bit of your perspective here. Perhaps you can give us an indicator of a sense of the population's morale. We've seen what daily life is like, but how are people really feeling also kind of towards the government, towards the regime? What is opinion on the ground right now?
Well, I was in Havana in December. Of course, that was before the complete oil blockade was put in place. But even then, the situation was really hard for people, and people are just very discouraged. And you know, at the time, they didn't think that their government had a really effective strategy for digging out of this crisis. And so, of course, many people blamed the government for not being able to do something about it. I think now it's a little clearer to people that it is the oil blockade that is a huge part of the problem that Cuba faces. But the comments that were made there about tourism are very true. Tourism has been, for the last 20 years, the centerpiece of the Cuban economy. They were doing very well before COVID. They had grown the tourist sector by, multiples over the previous couple of decades. But then the pandemic shut the tourist industry down completely for 2 years. And the industry has never fully recovered in Cuba the way it has in, say, the Dominican Republic or in Mexico. And part of that is U.S. sanctions. Trump's sanctions made it harder for people in the United States to go to Cuba, and we were one of the largest markets for Cuban tourism during the Obama years. Trump closed off the possibility of cruise ships going from the United States to Cuba, and a lot of the people in the United States who visited the island were doing it on cruises. And the United States put in even a punishment for Europeans. If Europeans travel to Cuba, they become ineligible for a visa waiver to visit the United States and have to apply, just like any visitor from another place, apply, pay a fee, be interviewed by a U.S. consular officer, and wait months before they'll find out if they're going to be allowed to visit. So that's a huge disincentive for Europeans to go to Cuba if they want to visit the United States. And all of that really did enormous damage to Cuban tourism. Today, because there's garbage in the streets and the lights are off half the time or more, it's not an attractive environment for tourists to go. And with the oil blockade, many airlines who have to fly a distance to get to Cuba, particularly Canadian airlines, because Canada is a very big tourist market for Cuba historically, the airlines have halted flights because Cuba can't refuel the jets when they're there. So the only airlines now that are consistently flying to Cuba are from the United States because we're close enough that the planes can carry enough fuel for the round trip.
And William, I want to bring in an interesting element here, or at least I find it interesting, and I'd like to get your take. One of Cuba's biggest folk singers of all time, Silvio Rodriguez, said in a recent post that he would take up arms if the US attacks Cuba. And now the Cuban armed forces have gifted him a rifle. So what sort of message does that send?
Well, the message that Silvio is trying to send is that the Cuban people won't stand for a U.S. intervention. And even critics of the government, and Silvio has been a pretty tough critic of the government in recent years, even critics of the government are going to rally around the flag and defend Cuban sovereignty if it comes to it. The government gifting him a rifle to do that is just obviously to take public relations advantage of his declaration.
Okay, well, I think that is a great way to end this interview. William Leogrand, Professor of Government at the American University in Washington, thank you so much for taking the time to delve into all of this with us here on DW. Great to have you with us.
My pleasure. Nice to speak with you again.
So, with Cuba stretched to its breaking point, what's your take? Can it resist US pressure well enough to negotiate a solution, or does the Trump administration hold all of the cards? Let us know in the comments. And if you like this video, please hit that like button. And if you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.